Thank you all for joining our webinar. My name is Alison Renwick and I'm the Head of Marketing here at TradeWindow. PwC is joining us today as co-hosts, and our topic we're going to be talking to is climate-related risks and opportunities for our New Zealand exporters. So I'll do a quick intro of our two speakers first before handing over to AJ, who can then kick us off. So our first speaker today is Andrew Jamieson. He's known as AJ. He jointly leads PwC's sustainability and climate change practice in New Zealand, and that is a focus on ESG strategy, climate change, reporting, and governance. And AJ has a background in environmental economics and has worked in organizational strategy, in operating model design and change, and he's been doing this for over 20 years in New Zealand and abroad. His team works with New Zealand organizations to help them understand and respond to climate change risks and opportunities, and how to prepare their businesses for voluntary and mandatory disclosures, as well as helping to build sustainable strategies as we move into a low carbon economy. Thank you for joining us today, AJ.
Thanks very much, Alison.
Our second speaker of the day is John Pennington, and he's known as JP. JP is an entrepreneur and founder of TradeWindow Assure Plus, which is formerly RFIDA, and that's a FDA award-winning global supply chain traceability solution. Currently executive manager at TradeWindow, JP also has over 20 years of experience working across the digital landscape. So that's with globally recognized brands including CGI, Boston Consulting Group, Deloitte Digital, and Apple. Welcome, JP.
Thank you, Alison. Great to be here.
Thanks. We will be holding a Q&A at the end of this session. So please, in the bottom of the box on the Zoom webinar, you should see a little Q&A session that you can pop up and include or type in any of your questions that you would like the team to address at the end of the webinar. So I think this is probably a good point for us now to hand over to AJ, and he can get us started. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alison, and welcome all. Look, I am going to talk for probably 15 or 20 minutes. There's quite a lot to cover, but what I'd like to do is get across the top of that conversation quite quickly, and then we can circle back and get a better feel for what specific parts of it the audience is interested in. I'm just going to share my screen and run you through a few slides, if that's all right. That should be coming up now. So the topic of conversation today is climate-related risks and opportunities in New Zealand. What we'd like to do is circle back very, very quickly and talk about climate change more generally. Then we'd like to split it into a couple of things, which is your impact on planet and society, and the planet's impact on and society's impact on you. There's an overarching theme here, which is transparency. There's a little bit of structure here, and we talk a little bit later to some of the sort of known frameworks for disclosure on climate-related risks and material issues, including TCFD and the XRB requirements for climate-related reporting entities. We're not going to drill too much into that one. I just wanted to very quickly come back to sort of the climate change 101 conversation. And the reason for this is that we often find ourselves in the sustainability profession talking fast and loose about things like 1.5 degrees and hothouse scenarios and 2100 climate change outcomes, as if everybody else should know what we're talking about. And so I think it's worthwhile just sort of centering back on some of those kind of key components of that longitudinal climate change conversation. So the conversation that we have about 1.5 degrees is a measure of ambient ground temperature rise since pre-industrial times. So basically, at some point in the 1850s, we understand what mean ground temperature looks like roughly around the world. And the hypothesis is that if we maintain our global ambient ground temperature to 1.5 degrees rise since that point, then the outcome will be exponentially better for us, although with some very severe implications and hooks. Who thought of this as the IPCC? So the IPCC can be thought of as the UN's crack team of climate boffins, and they had come up with these sort of scenarios and numbers in the early 90s. As time has gone on, their thinking has been ratified. People understand the severity of climate change. They understand the non-linearity of some of the key components of climate change once you factor in ocean warming, ice shelf melting, permafrost degradation, some of those issues. And now there's sort of clearer thinking about what that looks like if we get to 2 degrees, and then also what it looks like if we get to plus 3 degrees in what are commonly termed hothouse scenarios. The short answer is 1.5 degrees is not great, but plus 3 degrees is awful. The 1.5 degrees, the catch in that framework is actually we're probably 1.3 degrees, if not 1.4 degrees up from base, which means that there's not a heck of a lot of travel left in that equation. The consequences, I mean, locally we've seen what adverse weather looks like in the anniversary floods. There's some very real mega trends in this. So climate related refugees, there's a number being put on that as something like 700 million people might be risking displacement by 2030. The dollar figures on these are vast. We don't even need to look at some of the farming losses in Australia. We can look at some of the more recent losses to agriculture from weather events in New Zealand. The underwriting conversation is also an interesting one when you look at the anniversary floods, where in New Zealand that's probably one of the first times that we've seen a violent adverse weather event coincide with a real density of asset value, and the numbers on that are still being counted. There's sort of a societal and environment and an economic response to climate change. The climate change equation is massively complex, although the simplicity of it is that we just need to stop emitting. The large component of anthropogenic climate change is from carbon dioxide equivalents, is how it's measured, so just from GHG emissions. In New Zealand, there's a whole bunch of industry and government acts and regulations and non-legal industry standards which are coming to point towards how we need to respond to climate change. Part of this is actually how we account for ourselves and our own activities for climate change. So conceptually, the first part of the puzzle is everyone actually understanding what their footprint is. And the second part of that is, in some instances, mandatorily disclosing it on the basis that you have to know it to show it. And going through the disclosure process means that you need to understand what your own footprint is, increasingly what the footprint is across your supply chain, and then figure out what you're going to do about it, whether you think where you're sitting is fine, or whether you think you need to come up with a serious adaptation or transition plan to decarbonise. We sort of tend to think about this equation in sustainability and climate change in two ways. And the first one is like, what's our impact on the planet, which is our footprint, our energy efficiency, our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which I'll talk to a little bit very shortly. And then more widely, what's our ESG strategy? What's our environmental, social, and governance strategy look like to account for our activities, not just at their impact on the environment, but their impact on our local communities and our society more broadly. And then the second leg of this conversation will be the planet's and environment's impact on us, which is sort of split mainly into physical and transitional risks, which we can talk through in a little bit more detail shortly. Our impact on the planet, the easiest way to think about that is in emissions. So the main drivers of climate change are various greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, but carbon dioxide is the currency. So other greenhouse gases, including methane, are measured in CDEs, which is carbon dioxide equivalents. The global picture is that we emit 51 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases, and that number would be great if we could get that closer to zero. That means that we have to do one of two things, which is we have to take emissions out of our value chain, or it means that we have to do as much as we can to do that, and then at the non-mitigable end, we need to understand what additive offset activity looks like. So not just adhering our emissions to an existing forest plantation, but understanding how our emissions are adhered to a new plantation or a plantation that was in danger of being deforested. The way that we think about emissions are in scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope 1 is basically the stuff that we own and direct to produce product or services. That's pretty straightforward. It's our plant, it's the things that we own, and our vehicles that we own. Scope 2 is a fast follow, which is basically the things that we don't own, but which we use in order to directly produce value for our organisation. The easiest one of those to get your head around is really the sources of power that we don't generate ourselves. Then things get exponentially more complicated when we think about scope 3. So scope 3 is basically sort of phrased as indirect upstream and downstream. So upstream scope 3 activities are things that our suppliers do to help us add value in the left-hand side of our supply chain. So that includes waste, the footprint of other materials that go into our products, fuel used indirectly by our suppliers, and transportation used in the value chain arriving at our door, and then downstream is what happens once our products are in market. So distribution, reprocessing, the usage of our products and how they appear in the retail distribution landscape. If you are mandatorily disclosing at the moment under the XRB guidelines, or if you're close to an organisation that is, then the adoption provisions allow you to look at scope 1 and 2 now, and then start having a look at scope 3 upstream and downstream in 2 years' time. That becomes a mandatory disclosure item as well. Scope 3 is there's some nuance in there depending on what your downstream value chain looks like. For example, if you're an investment manager, you may well end up knowingly double or triple counting emissions, depending what types of organisations you own within a single economic community. The thematic part about your impact on society is that people care. So the GHG emissions is a relatively straightforward one. It's pretty easy to understand what your footprint looks like, and then it's pretty easy to understand what the activities are that you can do to mitigate that. More complicated are some of the wider pieces around what an ethical supply chain looks like for you, and which will depend not just on the workforce that you control directly, but also the components of the workforce involved in your supply chain, particularly your upstream supply chain. The short answer is that if you haven't been asked to think about your supply chain, or at least transparency on your supply chain, both origination and destination of goods, you soon will be. And understanding where your exposures are and where you sit will in no way be a bad investment going forward, because the environment for disclosures and the requirement by consumers for transparency is only increasing fast. Just have a quick chat about the planet and society's impact on your organisation. The primary piece of this conversation we're going to talk about is really climate change risks. As we transition towards a lower carbon economy. So this is split into two halves, which are related. So the physical risk piece of the puzzle is invariably the easier one for people to get their heads around. We understand what coastal processes look like. We understand conceptually what a sea level rise means. We experience on a daily or a weekly basis what extreme weather looks like, and we understand, you know, what happens when we get a drought and a heat wave, and our water reservoirs get down to the bottom. The more sort of complicated piece of the puzzle is what are known as transition risks, and transition risks are the risks arising from the reaction of the government and the economy and society around you. So transition risks are divided up into policy and legal risks. So what happens when the government outlaws, I don't know, coal importation? You know, do we end up with stranded assets in that part of the puzzle? What happens to the market around us with regards to access to financial services? What's the cost of capital if you're an emitting organisation? What is the propensity of your insurers to underwrite you on a cost-effective basis if you're sitting in an eroding geography? Reputation risk and consumer behaviour is clearly becoming and has been for a long time a very, very strong force of good in this equation, and part of the transition risk in that vector is actually looking at what your competitors are doing, because in some industries where it's very difficult to get yourself to a net zero position, actually the answer might be what's the sustainability story or what's the transparency story that your competitors are telling their consumers to underwrite their brand. And then technology risk, and technology risk is sort of sits on two sides of the same coin, which is what happens to the technologies that help us decarbonize and help us provide renewable energy resources. What are the technologies? What's the right time to invest in technologies for energy storage? And also, what are the technology changes which make some of the technology that we're holding obsolete? I'll skip through that one because I've sort of talked to those different types of risks. And then I wanted to just have a little chat about how we're seeing organisations. What do you do with these risks? So in thinking about climate change risks, it's all very well to understand that you might be at risk in your physical asset base from adverse weather events, but really the question is, you know, what does that actually mean for your organisation? Is it just something that's on your radar and you don't expect to have to mitigate it in now, or is it something that's on your radar that you need to have a serious think about? What are the types of impacts that could drive? Where do they visit on your business? And what do you need to do to mitigate them? I've pulled out as an example as a transition risk policy, particularly in New Zealand. We've got the fastest law in the West. We like policy. We particularly like policy in order to try and solve social ills. So we have got quite a fast moving legislative environment, particularly in climate change. So for example, carbon tax or cross-border carbon taxes, or a demonstrable increase in carbon price, or more industries being exposed to ETS, or less industries being protected by the EITS scheme, are all examples of how you might see, you know, some quite quick movement in order to visit a different cost and operational cost profile on your organisation. What we also see in this exercise is that at the end of this, if you come to the right-hand side of having done your thinking about those risks, and you still think it's not material, then that's fine. The really what, and you know, if, as an example in the XRB climate-related disclosures regime, what they're actually wanting organisations to do is to make sure that they have accounted for climate change risk, and that it is included as part of, is demonstrably included as part of their decision-making processes. The drivers in this field, not dissimilar to the sources of the risk in the first place, are actually happening quite quickly. the regulatory momentum is not just a New Zealand regulatory momentum. If you are an exporter, then these regulations are popping up all over the show. So the EU Green Deal is one. The labelling regulations in the UK is a space to watch. So in the UK, they are now saying that they think carbon neutral should not be a catch-all for organisations trying to prove that they have a net zero product. So they're going to make some changes around what the stringency is around those sorts of definitions. The New Zealand environment is that we have taken the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD regime, and we've actually turned it into a mandatory regime through the XRB, the External Reporting Board. At the moment, the climate-related disclosures regime applies to something like 200 New Zealand organisations. It's a very principle-based process. It's very well grounded in the tenets of TCFD. It seems to have been designed well with a very good on-ramp into organisations being able to spend a couple of years disclosing at a lighter end of the scale, and then in 2 or 3 years' time, they have got less adoption provisions to lean on and a greater onus on, for example, being clear on financial implications and Scope 3 emissions. However, that is only 200 organisations. But what we're seeing is more broadly is that some of the organisations captured by the disclosures regime, this puts an onus on them to understand the footprints and the risk profiles of their own organisations. The clear example being financed emissions and insured emissions in insurers and banks, which is they need to understand not just what their organisation's footprint is, but what is the footprint of the businesses that they are funding as well. The climate-related disclosures regime, I just wanted to point out one thing about why this is different to other disclosures, and that normally with disclosures you have a 100% accurate rear view mirror that you disclose on. So financial disclosures is pretty easy. You close your books at year end, you understand what your P&L looks like, you understand where your balance sheet's sitting, you mark some stuff to market, and then you disclose. With the climate-related disclosures, actually what they're looking for is a forward-looking focus on how you believe that climate-related risks are going to apply to your business model and your value chain, identifying the impacts both of physical and transitional risks and understanding how you're accounting for those and how resilient your strategy is, and reporting across your value chain upstream and downstream, and then moving towards an integrated disclosures regime where basically the climate-related risks form part of your annual cycle and are not a distinct operation separate to the rest of your disclosures. And I just wanted to sort of sign off by saying that, you know, that conversation about climate-related risks and opportunities and disclosures does not abrogate you from responsibility, or nor is it intended to be inclusive of the rest of your ESG mandate. So your ESG mandate more broadly across your environmental and social and your governance obligations and ambitions is a wider conversation, but with it comes an increasing demand by consumers, regulators, and suppliers for you to be transparent in all areas across that map. And I think, JP, that is probably me. So, Alison, let me just give you the screen back.
That's great. Thanks, AJ. There's been some good questions that have come through in the Q&A through that discussion as well, so please keep them coming and we can address these towards the end of the session. I think it's important for us to see here that the climate-related disclosures and sustainability do play a crucial role in the New Zealand government's agenda, but it's not only about reporting on the impact, it's also recognising these risks and opportunities and integrating these into our strategic decision making. So this kind of shift opens up some exciting possibilities for our exporters to be able to compete on a global stage. I think at this point, JP will bring you in on here, and you can continue the discussion around the opportunities that might be available to our exporters in New Zealand.
Yes, will do. Well, Andrew, thank you for that great introduction to the subject area, and Alison for that wrap up. It certainly does seem like a lot to get your heads around, especially as a small business where you may not necessarily have dedicated staff or capability, but it's also a lot to get your head around as a large organization as well. And here at TradeWindow, we're working with businesses of all different sizes across different industries and in different parts of the world to make collecting, sharing these types of information that you need to support your sustainability agendas. And when we talk about sustainability, that is the full ESG gambit that AJ talked you through earlier. So the environment, social, and the governance aspects of that. Now, as a software company, TradeWindow Assure Plus product is one of our extensive range of trade-related products. We sit, or the Assure Plus product sits in a really interesting area. You'll all be familiar with traceability, so that's just where did my products come from and where are they going to. We're seeing a big shift from one up, one down, being I know where something's come from and I know where it's going to, towards end-to-end supply chain traceability. We're also working in the space of transparency with Assure Plus, and that's really where factually based information can be surfaced either internally about your process, procedures, and ways you go about doing things, either internally or externally through to a buyer or a customer or a regulatory body. Now, in order to be able to provide full end-to-end traceability and to be more transparent around the processes and inputs and other areas across value chains, we need transformational tools. And that's where the Assure Plus platform comes in, because we've had to develop a new suite of tools from the ground up to make it easier than ever to be able to manage and turn all these data points that you need to capture and in order to be compliant, to be transparent. It's required new technology to address that. And back in I want to say last year, but now time flies, the year before last, we were awarded by the FDA for our work in supply chain traceability. And it's interesting timing for that award as well, because it really was a turning point in how people are referring to traceability, and the term traceability and transparency more and more being used synonymously with one another, with traceability meaning transparency and transparency meaning traceability. So definitely a lot we're seeing in that area, and a good shout out by AJ as well, that the demand for transparency is increasing rapidly. Now, we're working with businesses around the world, and I think just about on every continent, we have goods being managed on the Assure Plus platform. And these are goods we're managing not just the traceability related information, but also transparency related information, and helping solve a variety of types of sustainability data collection challenges. For example, we're working with coffee exporters in Brazil, in Colombia, in Indonesia, parts of Africa, in and around proving their non-deforestation related credentials. Now, they're having to do that because of EU regulations, which have said, look, if you come from these set of countries, and you're selling commodities, you need to prove that they have not been the result of deforestation in the last couple of years, and otherwise they're not getting across the border. So we're working across a wide range of challenges, different types of products, everything from meat products through to coffee and other specialty goods. So what are the type of things that we are helping capture traceability information about? Well, we're capturing information across value chains. We are adding or provide the tools to collect critical tracking event information. Where's something been? Where's it going to? Recording quality assurance related information such as the temperature, or in the case of coffee, it could be a green bean coffee bean analysis, for adding certificates and audit information as the product moves along as a value chain. And we collect that information not just for products, but also for property, plant, equipment, and also there's the possibility to collect information around people who handle this product at this particular point in time, at this particular location. The need for collecting such a wide and varied amount of traceability related information has really pushed the need to mobilize and use advanced digital tools in new ways across value chains. So really removing paper. Paper is the enemy of transparency. I think it's actually the enemy of efficient business operations. But it's definitely pushed us, a lot of businesses, more into adopting these mobile first tools to collect the types of information that are needed. So for example, if you're a beekeeper and you need to record your hive location or something you're doing around the hives, well, there's no point in putting that in paper, then taking it back to the office, then re-entering it in another system. And maybe you've got some photos and they sit off in another place, and somehow miraculously been tried to manage all of this and making it available at the right place and the right time is very difficult without tools like these. So we're thrilled and delighted to be working with businesses of all sizes, from small honey business, for example, through to some of the largest commodities companies in the world, around modernizing their workforces to collect that better data that is the foundation for transparency. And we heard AJ talk about before, and I love the phrase, you've got to know it to show it. And knowing it really starts with having good quality data points to work with. And that really means a shift away, finally, from paper. I think it's a shift away as well from information that's sitting in data silos, whether it's in an email or a particular file format or on somebody's independent device, really providing a platform where all of these things could be managed and harnessed from one location to provide that traceability is more and more important. And if we think around the topic of transparency, well, that's a whole new world, because the level of information, the factual information that you need to put on top of the traceability information is quite vast, and it's just not possible without modern tools. The overhead and the cost of attempting to do it in any other way is incredibly high. So you think around the types of information that you need for your products in order to say, hey, we're transparent around what we do and how we make our product and how we get it to market. And there's a lot of information that needs to be collected. Now, some of these are related back to sustainability. Some of them are not. Every product is different. And I'd certainly encourage everyone on the call, listening to the call today, to look across their value chains and look through and try and understand what's going to be required in order for them to be able to say, in order for you to be able to say, what makes our product transparent? What is going to be needed for our buyers or regulatory bodies or consumers, or even our internal processes or internal operations, for us to make a more informed usage or purchase decision of that item. So we work with organizations to map these things out and really figure out strategies around how do you capture them, how do you process them, and how do you store them, and then how do you make them available at the right place and the right time. So the one I want to focus on with you in the limited time that we have today is the CO2e calculation. And that is part of, we touched upon earlier, the GHG CO2e areas and the different scopes. Again, the scope 1 are the things to be worried about now, scope 2 very shortly, and scope 3 are coming fast. And it's interesting with the scope 3, we're going to focus on transportation and distribution because that's at the heart of what we do here at TradeWindow. But if you think around having traceability and transparency and the depth of information to know it in order to be able to show it, collecting and managing this information is good practice. It's good business practice. It will help you make a more informed decision. One of the questions I get asked quite often is, what is the cost of implementing this? Well, there's two sides to that. There's also a benefit. And what is the benefit to your organizations of being more informed and having better data, especially in the times of greater supply chain disruption, such as the time we've seen recently with the pandemic, and now also with the issues that we're having around climate change and global warming, etc. So focusing in on the transportation side of things, the Assure Plus platform is incredibly well suited to capturing and storing a range of different ESG related information and collecting that and having it in one place so that it's easy to manage. Now, if you've got particularly good eyesight, you'll notice a middle screen, there's something there that says an emission event. And I'm going to take you through how we are creating CO2 emissions records from freight records in a very, very quick space of time. And that's done through the importation of freight records. But there's also the sustainability and sourcing maps and those sorts of things as well, which become very important for telling your story. They become very important as well for attributing your different measures to locations, farms, etc., plants, and such and so forth. So we've got really a great suite of tools to be able to address any type of data collection, but I'm just going to focus in on the emissions side with you. So we've been working with a number of organizations to see how we can optimize the processing of freight records in order to be able to provide a CO2 emissions figure. Now, having a great baseline for this is really important. Having a measure too that is based on internationally recognized standards for calculating CO2, for example, is also very, very important. So we were able to process roughly 4,000 freight events. Now, these events by freight, they could be sea, they could be air, they could be road, could be train, if you're in Europe, possibly a barge as well. And we're able to process 4,000 records in just a few seconds and get a very, very accurate measure of the CO2 calculation. Now, in this exercise, that was done retrospectively. So at the end of the calendar year, we took the records and processed them. But this is something that we would recommend organizations to do on a regular basis, whether it's monthly or quarterly, so that you can make course corrections if you're not tracking towards your desired CO2 emissions figure for freight. We definitely want to see the date where organizations start making more informed real-time decisions and making transportation choices based on the CO2 emissions, so that you're not reliant on that point in time looking back, how well did we do? You can be making real-time choices all the time. So capturing and having this information in one place allows you to share through to your customers, your buyers of your products, or regulatory bodies, a record of those events. Now, these are very accurate records. They are based on a number of inputs, everything from container type, ship type, journey time, time of year, time of day. All of those things get factored in. And if you are on a flight, for example, it will actually, and you can give the tail number of the plane or the flight number and the date. These tools can actually go away and calculate a record for that particular flight, for the weight that you had on it, given the flight time conditions, etc. at that time. So it's very accurate, and I think it's important to know before you start to think about your CO2 emissions whether accuracy matters to you. I would argue that accuracy always matters, and I would say that it matters probably more than ever when we're dealing with such small increments having such a big impact on the global warming targets. So once these records are stored, they can be either shared digitally into other systems of record, or they can be downloaded as a PDF and shared to a customer so that they have a record of, hey, what actually was the CO2 associated with this order that I got from you? And in turn, that helps them with their reporting. So they're tools that can be used downstream, but also can be used for that upstream, can be used upstream, but also for that downstream sharing of information. Now, I mentioned earlier on that transparency starts with accurate data, and that really is the case. It's not with paper. So I do have a lot of organizations saying, well, where do I start in this measurement and improvement? We always think it's a great idea to move away from paper. It's great that you're measuring something, but certainly to move towards digital measurements where you've got all the information in a standardized way. You've got a record of who conducted that, who conducted the collection of that information, and such and so forth. And the digital tools enable you to have proof points around where that information was collected, where was that data point collected, allows you to capture more rich evidence around the types of processes that you're running in your factories or your farms or wherever you're operating from, in the form of video and photographic evidence. This all contributes towards the transparency in your supply chains, and will ultimately make it easier for you to receive the various or comply with the various types of certificates that are popping up and regulatory requirements that are popping up around the world. Everybody's path is different. I often get asked, where do you start on your sustainability journey? This is an example of a customer that we're currently working with. They wanted to start their sustainability measure with the down on their farm plots, their processing, their planting methods, and actually capturing evidence about that and how they were changing from a way that they're working today to a new way. They then wanted to tackle the CO2e emissions targets, and that's all around capturing that baseline, starting to measure the transportation side. Then they wanted to work on the byproduct processing and measuring the volume of a product, which was they were throwing away a byproduct. They were able to turn that particular byproduct into an animal feed, and they wanted to be able to be very accurate on the amount that they were capturing. And then another really interesting part to all of this is the digital label side of things. If you've got a product and you're doing the right things, actually getting these measures and these evidence into a format that can be easily accessed by other supply chain participants and end users. This sort of thing can be up and running in less than 90 days. There's some things that can be up and running in less. So, and you don't necessarily have to have dedicated staff working on these things. If you've got a sponsor, there are organizations like ours that are very happy to work with you to implement these plans based in and around our software solutions. So they're not a bigger than Ben-Hur ERP type of implementation. They're things that can be done in short, manageable sprints and have demonstrable value in doing so. And last but not least, back to this topic of digital labels. If you know it, then why not show it? Transparency is something that we believe organizations can compete on, and we are seeing businesses compete on transparency and making that information available at the right place and the right time to make an informed purchase decision. So the digital label side, very important, from moving away from just the facts to that integrity-based piece, and that is around providing a view on the traceability of the product. It is around being transparent around all the great things, brands that you're doing as a brand, as a company, around your sustainability goals and objectives, etc. And it is about wrapping it up in a branded experience that your customers will be and users of your products will be expecting. So it's really the turning something which is a cost really into a value generator for your organization. And if you are doing the right things, why not compete on being transparent about it and making that information available to end customers? So it's an area we get a lot of requests on, and an area we're spending a lot of time on is how do we surface this great work we're doing to be competitive. So that's both with producers, but we're also working with certifying bodies in and around as well, space as well. So regenerative farming, auditing companies, for example, we're working with them on how to modernize their process. And when a certificate of regenerative farming is being issued, how do you get that information onto labels such as this one that you see in front of you? So a very hot space. Digital labels, bit of a side conversation, but they are something, a move towards the GS1 digital link standard is happening, and it's a fantastic mechanism to start unlocking these brand in hand experiences and to help organizations to start to compete on transparency. So with that, I hope that's brought it full circle around understanding what ESG is and sustainability, what's happening in sustainability here in New Zealand, but also what we're doing as a New Zealand innovator to help organizations compete and win on transparency. Over to you, Alison.
Thanks, JP. Just to call out, if there are any other questions that you'd like addressed from what you've heard discussed in the session today, to just pop these into the Q&A box. I'll just read through a few questions that have come through here. The first one is, where is the force of this reporting coming from? You mentioned banks and insurance companies, and what other compliance or obligations are there? So that's probably a question for you there, AJ.
Yeah, I think the short answer is it's coming from multiple directions. So the clear one in New Zealand is the XRB mandatory disclosures, which are visited on 200 climate reporting entities starting in financial year 2024. They are defined as banks and insurers over a certain size, listed entities, and debt issuers. So, for example, Auckland Council Group, on the basis of the bonds that they issue as a climate reporting entity. The extension for that is that because if you're in a competitive environment, if your major competitors are voluntarily disclosing, then when people start to make decisions on how well they think their corporate suppliers are behaving, they will want you to disclose at some point. The banks and insurers will shortly be having to figure out, as I said previously, which emitters are they supporting through debt funding, or which emitters are they underwriting, which means that it's not just the entity, it's the entity's customers that will need to start not publicly disclosing, but disclosing to the banks what their position is. There's also a very, very long list of cross-border mechanisms. So one which is coming across the horizon is CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So CBAM, the premise of CBAM is I can't just do all my emissions in the country next door in order to produce my product and send it to an economy. Each jurisdiction wants to know the emissions that are factored into that product, so that they can make a decision as to whether you are taxed or where you sit in their regime. And then there's things like, and in all fairness, even MFAT struggle to keep across some of the sort of speed and breadth of regulation internationally. But there's things that have happened recently, like the S211 bill in Canada was just passed about 2 weeks ago, which basically puts an obligation on exporters whose destination market is Canada to provide positive assurance that there's no possibility of specifically child labour, but any goods produced with any use of modern slave labour in their supply chain. So the forces are both push and pull factors. So the push factors in our parlance are the regulations. Sometimes it's not a regulation, sometimes it's an industry standard. But then the pull factors are what it is that you do voluntarily to drive your business down those positive vectors of change. And what are your consumers expecting from you, or what are your competitors doing that you need to keep up with relatively?
Great, thanks AJ. We hope that answers the question for you. Another question that's come through here, I think will be for you, JP. It's, do you process transportation records from different resources? So this is probably relating to the CO2 piece.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. Records can be processed from any source and pass through these services that we provide. Of course, if you're a TradeWindow customer today, getting that information from ProDoc, for example, it's a relatively straightforward process. But if you have your transportation records, whether they're sea, air, rail, road, they're all things that can be processed and stored into the Assure Plus platform.
Another one here for you, JP. So is there a cadence that you need to do for the CO2 calculations?
Well, I'd like to think that we'll get to a point where people are making real-time decisions, or AI engines are making real-time decisions on routing shipments through the most efficient and environmentally friendly ways, and managing that trade-off between the two. The reality at the moment, it is probably more of I think a monthly or a quarterly exercise. I think annually is too late, looking back on the year and say, oh, we're over. It doesn't give you a lot of room for course correction. So if you can do this sort of uploading or processing of the data, or if you're doing real-time calculations, it should be something that's looked at in a monthly business review or quarterly business review, in line with if you're a corporate, your broader sustainability programs, or if you're a small business, it's just something to keep track of on a monthly or quarterly basis.
Cool. Thanks, JP. What is the difference between decarbonisation and carbon neutrality, and what steps can exporters take on this journey? Is that one for you, AJ?
Yeah, sure. So the definition is actually pretty simple. So carbon neutrality is where you are neutral from a net carbon perspective, but you would have used offsets. So you may still be emitting, but you'll be buying offsets, whether they're NZUs or some other sort of voluntary offset mechanism to account for your emissions, and carbon tonnage equals zero. Net zero is quite different. So net zero is saying, as an organisation, you want to get to a net zero position, but the offsets is a measure of last resort. So in the first instance, you're going to remove, avoid, recover if possible, and then at the bottom of that stack, you're going to offset. So quite a sort of different level of intention. There are some sort of, if you sign up to things like SBTIs, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, then there are some standards around what's expected by way of direct mitigation action versus offsetting. I'd probably circle back to one of the the initial points, which is that the very first step is understanding what your emissions profile looks like as an organisation. There are probably some quick wins just in things like energy efficiency and some technology choices that tend to be some of the low-hanging fruit before you start looking more strictly into what your value chain looks like and where your emissions reside.
Great, thanks, AJ. I think this is probably one for you, JP. How do we convince our supply chain partners that we all should be moving towards traceability? And how do we find a solution that will be a good fit for use for all of us?
Yeah, that's a great question. Ultimately, traceability and transparency in supply chains requires collaboration, and it requires working towards some common goals and objectives. I think that the foundation of these sort of endeavors starts with clear and open communication between the different partners. Why are we collecting? What's the benefit in collecting this information and sharing these types of information? I think it's around starting in small, manageable ways as well to be able to demonstrate the value of having that type of information. That's also very important. And to some degree, it's also talking about the downside of not doing it and being very clear on that also. It could be losing access to market for a product, making a product less desirable, less demand for a particular product or issue. I think there's opportunity for all members of value chains to compete and win on supply chain transparency. So it's around getting the various participants on common grounds around what the benefits are, what the downsides are as well, and then just breaking it down into smaller, manageable chunks, so you can all see all start to see the benefits at relatively the same time.
Great, thank you. I think that probably brings us to time. Just if there is anybody on the call who would like to have some time set up between yourself and TradeWindow or JP, you can contact us at marketing@tradewindow.io. But just wanting to thank our co-host today, so that's PwC. We had AJ coming on with us. And thank you, JP, for your insights into traceability, transparency, and moving forward in the digital transformation side of things. So I think that'll be us ending off for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison.
Thank you, Alison.
Thanks all.
Thank you, Andrew.